Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. In our final conversation with Dr. Chris Talbot, she's the author of Sonia Johnson, a Mormon feminist, we're going to dive into some of Sonia's interesting relationships following her divorce and excommunication from the LDS Church. We're also going to talk about whether there was a conspiracy in the church and whether we can just see how involved the church was in the Equal Rights Amendment. So you won't want to miss this conversation. Check it out. But I guess let's jump back into the relationships
Along
again.
the way, there's a lot about relationships. Yeah.
Because to me, tell me if you agree or disagree with it, but I just found it so ironic. The church is worried, and I think conservatives in general are worried that if we pass the ERA, everybody's going to become a lesbian and the men are going to become gay. And then she
becomes a lesbian.
Yeah. I was like,
Yeah.
wow, that's weird. Is that like prophecy? What is that? What would you call that?
An interesting irony. It's an interesting irony. Right. But really, much of that comes out of her commitment to women sort of like almost as a species. And so her lesbianism really comes out of that commitment to women. And she sort of says, at the end of the ERA issue, she's not particularly interested in having a relationship at all. But she also says, no man will ever become the center of my life again. Because for her, that sort of wraps itself right back around this kind of male-centered, male-oriented, male-identified patriarchal society. And so she kind of wants no part of that. There was also at the same time a kind of movement that historians refer to, it's not really a movement, it's sort of a phenomenon that historians refer to as political lesbianism, which is this kind of choice to devote oneself to women as a species, really. I'd frame it that way, but sort of as a group, as a collective, and build one's life around those devotions. Which partly means that you can't really have intimate relationships with men if the core of your life is going to be built around women. And so it's a different kind of lesbianism with a different set of motivations than people who are sort of sexually oriented toward women or in the way that we think of today.
Yeah, she wouldn't have been sexually oriented towards women then. Is that true? Could we... to use the sociological term, is she a bisexual or is she a true lesbian?
I don't really know.
She had a couple kids. We haven't talked about that.
Just 4 children.
4.
Yeah. I'm always suspicious of discrete categories when it comes to sexuality and sexual orientation. Most people experience themselves in discrete categories, but a lot of people really don't experience their sexuality in discrete categories. And sexuality is fluid. And this might be controversial, and this is just a sort of personal philosophy, but I always think of sexual orientation as historical. You don't know what's going to happen tomorrow.
You could turn into a...
You don't know. You've made a commitment. People make commitments to certain kinds of trajectories, but you don't know. So this is just my own little personal philosophy, that I tend to think of sexual orientation as historical. And it's mushy. I don't know. So I don't know.
So she was heterosexual until she got excommunicated and then?
Sure. Sure, we can go with that. I think the question you're asking me is she really a lesbian?
Yeah.
I don't know what that term means. And it's especially a difficult question in relationship to these political commitments, right? Because the women who
is she a political lesbian as opposed to a natural lesbian? Or I don't know what the term is.
I don't know. I don't know that's such a...
You're the gender studies expert.
Yeah, yes, I am. That's probably why I don't know.
Okay.
Is that we have tend to have much more nuanced ways of thinking about these things. Because the science seems to be fairly clear that there is at least a biological relationship to people's sexual orientation, but it doesn't seem to be completely biological. But again, the science is very messy and we don't really know, and people also make all kinds of choices in relationship to felt sexual feelings. Lots of people who are probably naturally bisexual, whatever that might mean, make decisions in one way or another around sexual orientation. They make commitments to individuals with gender, which by default means a commitment to a given sexual orientation. So I don't know what a real lesbian is.
It would strike me, and she does. I don't know if we can call it a biological lesbian. She didn't strike me as a biological lesbian. She wasn't attracted to women naturally until her excommunication. And could you argue maybe that was such a traumatic experience for her that she rejected men completely and decided to start relationships with women?
You could make that argument. I don't know how accurate it would be. She did say for a number of years after her excommunication that she didn't really feel any sexual attraction to women. So that seems to be something that grew in her as she moved along. She doesn't seem to have a history of it. She didn't, a lot of people will say, like, I knew when I was 4 years old, or I've known all my life. Or she did not seem to have that experience. But I don't know if that makes her a fake lesbian or a real lesbian or a political lesbian or what. I don't know. I mean, those are all very sort of socially constructed categories anyway, but.
So, because she did have at least 2 that I remember lesbian relationships after. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit more about those?
Yes. So
because the first one didn't end very well, it didn't sound like.
No, it did not. She got herself a therapist and proceeded to fall in love with that therapist, which is all sorts of ethically problematic. And that person also took over as her sort of behind the scenes kind of manager sort of figure, sort of making the phone calls about public appearances and getting the checks cashed and that sort of thing. And that relationship did not end well. And it really began to really develop her philosophy about relationships generally, which she published primarily one book and sort of a book that's half about that, about relationships. And that relationship didn't end well, in part because Sonia didn't particularly like sex. And part of the reason that she articulates about not liking sex is that it has hierarchy embedded within it. And I don't want to get terribly graphic here, partly because I know some of your audience is. But there's always someone who's doing something to someone else to try to produce a feeling in someone else. And that level of hierarchy really, she found very, very troubling, sort of personally and politically and philosophically.
Could we say that one person in any relationship has a higher sex drive than the other, and she was generally the lower sex drive person?
That's probably true, but it was much more about the actual encounter and the way that, like, without getting terribly graphic, but someone is doing the driving and someone is being driven in most encounters. And those things might switch off in all sorts of ways, and they might be equally shared roles, but at any given moment, generally speaking, someone is driving and someone is a passenger. And that level of hierarchy just did not sit well with her.
She really hates hierarchy.
She really hates hierarchy, really a lot. And it just didn't sit well with her. So all of those things sort of combined to produce a philosophy that comes out in her 4th book. I have to count her 4th book and a little bit in the 5th book. Her 4th book is called The Ship That Sailed into the Living Room. And it's really a critique of relationships. And essentially what she argues is that relationships are by their very nature built around hierarchy. People alternate roles, and some people are sort of in a hierarchy that looks this way on Tuesday and this way on Wednesday and this way on Thursday and this way on Friday, but they are nonetheless built on hierarchy. And so her 4th book is really a pretty damning criticism of the nature of relationships.
I mean, because as we look at it, she clearly, this was in the 80s, so clearly gay marriage wasn't even legal, wasn't even much of it. I shouldn't say it wasn't much of a consideration, because
we talked about it during the ERA. People talked about it during the ERA, but the conversation had well faded by the early 1980s.
Well, and I know that there's some documents out there on Reddit or somewhere where Dallin Oaks kind of laid out the kind of a legal case, kind of like Rex Lee on
Sure. Yeah.
earlier.
Yep.
Dallin Oaks did it for gay marriage because they were concerned that gay marriage would be legal. But as far as Sonia's concerned, marriage wasn't really an
She
option.
didn't want anybody to marry anybody.
It doesn't sound like she was really a free love person either. I mean,
it's difficult. Yeah, we don't really have terms to be able to put her in a category, particularly around relationships. She was, and I just discovered this. I discovered this actually after the book was published, that there was a small polyamory community in Salt Lake City that read the book fairly widely. As
Sonia's book.
Read Sonia's fourth book fairly widely as a sort of guide to like why monogamy is problematic. I don't know that they came to the same kinds of conclusions about what to do about that Sonia did, but they came to a sort of conclusion around a set of conclusions around why monogamy is problematic is because it has this hierarchy inside of it. It is by its very nature controlling of one's sexuality, controlling of one's love, really. I mean, that's sort of the point, right? Like, that's the point of marriage, is that you commit to love someone and you commit to be sexually faithful to that person. And so they found that restrictive and controlling.
Okay.
Yeah, so that relationship doesn't end well. Then she gets in another relationship that also doesn't end well. And then she meets, now this is also where the language becomes problematic because we don't have good language for what Sonia's doing, but she meets her current, let's call it partner, because we don't have a better term for that, but she meets the person that she currently lives with and has lived with for quite some time, Jade DeForest. Yep. And what they sort of begin to do is they both...
Is that continued on to this day?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
So she's still with this person?
She is still living with this person. And what they do is they try to figure out a kind of experiment. And you see this very much in the fifth book, Out of This World, that they call the touching experiment. And basically what they do is make a commitment to each other that we touch each other and other people and whomever else for self-motivated reasons only. We touch each other for the pleasure of doing the touching, not to produce a set of feelings in the other person. So if I want to hold your hand, it's because I want to hold your hand, not because I want you to feel something in response to me holding your hand. If I want to rub your back, it's because I want to rub your back, not because I want you to feel something in response to rubbing your back. Because that gets that hierarchy in there in which someone's driving and someone's being driven. And they sort of take this experiment into their relationship, and that is sort of the ground on which that relationship is built. And so various forms of sexuality, of what we might call sexual and sexuality, are experienced within that relationship, but sort of within the sort of rules of this touching experiment, if that makes sense. And so that really becomes the basis on which that relationship is built.
And that one has been a successful relationship.
That one seems to be successful, yeah.
Yeah. Well, very good. So what are the biggest takeaways from your study of that?
Oh, wow. I mean, the biggest takeaways, one of the things I least expected about this project was how contested the facts were. Yeah, I could write 30 or 40 pages about Donahue, about how Sonia came to appear on Donahue by herself. I didn't, but I could.
You had a page count to keep.
I mean, the basic ground level facts are so disputed. And the role of the church, and I talk about this fairly early on in the book, like about who's doing what in the church. And I'd say something like, sometimes it's not clear who's doing what. And so the ambiguous term, the church or church leaders, is as clear as I can be about who's doing a thing. And one of the central questions that comes up that I don't answer is it the church that's doing this activism? Who's doing the activism? Is it the church? Is it the women? Is it the priesthood? Is it the men? And I don't have a great answer to that, because some of the answer to that question depends on how you think about what the church is. And Beverly Campbell addresses that a couple of times. So Beverly Campbell goes on to be sort of the church's official spokesperson on the ERA in the wake of the Donahue show, because they realize that she's just some woman. And you can't have just some woman talking for the church. And so it's not clear if she was appointed the official spokesperson before or after the Donahue show. That's mushy. I get different reports about that. Campbell and Smith say before, Johnson and Darlene Hayes say after. I don't know. But at some point, she gets appointed as the official church spokesperson on the ERA, and she's often asked these questions, like, who's doing this? And what she says is, we use the church hierarchy because it's there. We already have phone trees. But the citizens' councils are not official arms of the church. They are not structurally incorporated into the church. Therefore, the church isn't doing it.
Isn't that the same argument that we had with Prop 8 in California?
Yes, it's literally exactly the same argument. And in fact, the funding model is very similar, as it turns out.
Okay, so because the church continually denied that they had anything to do with Prop 8, but yet there's evidence that there was some involvement.
Yeah. Yeah.
So here's the thought that pops into my head, because I had forgotten about President Hinckley as being in special affairs, but it does seem, correct me if I'm wrong, that there is a common line with President Hinckley being involved.
It does seem very
with
much like
special
that.
affairs in gay marriage and with Sonia Johnson.
Mm-hmm. He seems
Can you
to be
comment more on that?
Not really, other than that he does seem to be a common denominator in many of those.
And you haven't been able to get access to his diaries yet.
No. The funding models are very similar, right? Which is where, and it's difficult to sort of say and there's a lot of language around, like, in what capacity is a person acting? When deacons are handing out leaflets to church members, are they acting as deacons, or are they just like young men handing out a pamphlet? When bishops are asking for donations at someone's house in their white suit and tie, are they acting as bishops, or are they just like some guy in the neighborhood asking for donations? When they're collecting donations at the bishop's office and they say, drop your checks off at the bishop's office, are they acting as bishops, or are they just like, this is a convenient location, sort of like a post office? You
don't want to weigh in on that? Because that doesn't, I can...
Again, it goes back to how you think about what the church is. If the church is its formal structural, bodies of institutions like the Young Women's Association and the Priesthood Association, it becomes more difficult to make an argument that the church is doing it. If you think of the church as something like a culture, a community, an imagined community,
plausible deniability,
a set of expectations and rules that most people understand and follow, it becomes much more difficult to make an argument that the church is not doing it. It becomes easier to make an argument the church is doing it.
Clearly Sonia was making the argument that the church was doing it.
Yes.
So you're just saying it's really fuzzy? Are you just being politically correct here?
What I'm saying is it depends on how you think about what the church is.
Okay.
If you think of the church as its official organizations and institutions, it is true that the citizens' councils were not official parts of the church. That is just true.
But if President Hinckley was given influence, then is it just so that we can do plausible deniability?
It looks that way to me.
Okay.
But I'm not going to take an official scholarly position on that, because I don't have a diary from President Hinckley that says, you know what I did? I went down to there to organize the VACC so the church would have plausible deniability. I don't have such a smoking gun. And I think that's likely on purpose. But I can't make a definitive statement about the absence of in the absence of a smoking gun, I can't make a definitive statement about the absence of a smoking gun.
Were there people on the grassy knoll?
Yeah, it's very much a grassy knoll situation. Yeah. And so it really depends on how you think about what the church is. If you think of the church as a community, as a set of expectations, as a kind of language that we all sort of speak and understand, and, we kind of know that when the bishop comes wearing his khakis and his, flannel, he's acting as a private individual. And when he comes wearing his white suit and tie, he's sort of acting as a bishop. So how he shows up at our house, we kind of know how that all shakes out. But also, I don't know. Is he?
Well, very good.
So it's mushy.
Yeah.
And and so how?
So did you ask to get President Hinckley's diaries and were told no?
I did not. I was pretty clear about what that answer would like to be. So I did not ask.
Well, I'm just amazed.
But to give the Church Archive credit, though, they did give me very wide access to the Beverly Campbell papers.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, which I very much appreciated. So thank you, whoever did that.
Were you ever turned down for anything that you asked for?
I don't think I was. No, I don't think I was.
Well, that's good to
Yeah,
hear.
they gave me pretty broad access.
Because, Matt Harris, of course, came out with Second Class Saints, which is just incredible.
Just incredible.
I was just like, how did you get all this stuff?
Just impossible. He must spend half his time building those relationships.
Oh, I'm
Which
sure.
is fantastic. Yeah, it's great. Yeah.
But, do you see doing that kind of a book on the ERA or anything in the future where you could really dive in and get President Monson's access and, whatever, President Hinckley?
Probably not. What I do see, though, is some more research coming out about Sonia Johnson's later work. This spends just barely nicks the surface of the National Organization for Women presidential campaign, the U.S. presidential campaign, her work as a theorist, some other kinds of activism and organizing that she did. So
So are you looking at doing another book on her?
I'm not sure if it'll be a book or articles, but more is coming. More is coming. I'm not sure the form it will take quite yet, but more is coming. I had to get this one done first.
Well, very good. Are there any other projects you're working on besides Sonia?
This is the primary one. I have some that have sort of been on the back burner for a while, but I don't want to talk about them because I'm not sure when they'll get to the front burner, unfortunately. Yeah.
That's a bummer. We got to get some breaking news here.
My breaking news is my Mormon Studies Review article coming out that really situates this essay in the context of media and in the context of the sort of public attention around the priesthood and temple bans.
That will be out within the next year?
Yes.
Okay, for sure. Okay. Well, we might have to have you back.
All right.
Or maybe I'll have to go to Greeley. I don't know. Greeley, is that about an hour north of Denver?
About that, yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, Dr. Chris Talbot, I thank you so much for being here on Gospel Tangents.
It's been really fun.
And I hope you're not a stranger.
Absolutely not. This has been really great fun, and it's really been lovely to sit and chat with you about Sonia.
All right. Well, thanks a lot.
All right. Take care.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Dr. Chris Talbot from the University of Northern Colorado. Chris, thank you so much for coming out here. Can't wait to see you in June at Mormon History Association. And thanks again. I want you all to go out and buy your book, Sonia Johnson, A Mormon Feminist. It's a fantastic book, so you definitely want to have this in your collection. In our next conversation, I'm excited to have Dr. Jesse James back on the show. We're going to talk about conspiracy theories.
Today, we're going to be talking about conspiracy theories, the psychology of conspiracy theories, and specifically applying that science to the conspiracy theory that Brigham Young was the one who started polygamy rather than Joseph Smith.
You ready for some slings and arrows?
I know, it's pretty contentious out there.
If you like what we're doing here on Gospel Tangents, please sign up for our Patreon, and as little as $5 a month, you can access the entire interviews. We can also show full videos and give access to collections. So sign up at patreon.com/gospeltangents. Help support me to keep this podcast running.